Hello and a very warm welcome to Quadriga, DW's international talk show coming to you from the heart of the German capital, Berlin. I'm Brian Thomas. Our topic today, the famine in East Africa. The UN is calling it the worst humanitarian crisis since the end of World War II. The hardest hit nations are South Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya. There are fears right now that this could become far worse. More than 20 million people are already affected, with that number climbing every day. It's not only drought and climate change that are behind the human suffering. Experts say corrupt elites, government using warfare to prop up their regimes, and ineffective relief programs are feeding a vicious cycle that's proving extremely difficult to break. To talk about why this famine is so extreme, why aid programs are coming up short, and what can be done to turn this around, I'm joined in the studio by Jörg Kleis. He's the co-founder of Africa Works. He's also a blogger and author who focuses on Africa. He says what we truly need is a vision of European-African relations and how we can complement each other. The Eurocentric notion of helping Africa and developing Africa is not a part of that. Also with us, Kiflemariam Gebrewold. He's worked for different NGOs in the development aid sector for about 20 years. Last year, he came back from Ethiopia, where he worked alone for 10 years. His summary is disillusioning. He believes development aid programs are useless. Until today, no country has been developed through development aid. Also with us is Dagmar Dehmer. She's an editor at the Berlin-based daily newspaper Tagesspiegel. She reports on climate change and development. She says, the famine early warning system works well, but the humanitarian aid system only begins to work once we see pictures of starving children. Welcome to everyone for being here today, and welcome to the show. First off, I'd like to start with our climate correspondent, Dagmar, to establish the scope of this crisis. Just how bad is it? You know, this is an extremely serious drought in East Africa, but 2 years ago, experts saw it coming. Why the panicked response now?
That happens all the time. I mean, we actually knew since 3 years what was coming because we had a strong El Nino. We knew in time that it would come, and we knew more or less how it would play out in East Africa. It's, of course, not the first time. It's always like that there are warnings, they are proper, everybody knows about it. Aid organizations are already warning early, but nobody is listening till the pressure is really there.
Okay, Kiflemariam, you've just returned from Ethiopia. What happened? What went wrong? Why are we finding out so late about this serious situation?
The problem is that we have a very good early warning system, famine early warning system, since 1985, supported through satellite and NASA system, but we don't have an early response. The international machinery, the donor world, and the governments are not equipped to respond quickly, and they claim that they have to show first the small African child with a big belly in order to get funds mobilized. Otherwise, people wouldn't give them. So what we need is actually not to wait for the international community to do something, but to take our governments into task and our region into task to mobilize their own resources. And up to a certain degree, the Ethiopian government has done so. Otherwise, the situation would be even worse.
Okay, Jörg, what's gone wrong in your opinion? Why are we finding out about this so late?
I'm not surprised about this at all, because for the last 60 years, from my perspective, the problem with the European notion of developing Africa has been the entirely wrong approach. When we were talking about helping and aiding, we have, in fact, perverted the morally good idea of assisting and supporting one another and turned it into a billion-dollar industry which does have no impact. Whenever we're talking about projects on the ground, we fail to make the connection between something that is functioning and working, but there is no impact. And we have to come to understand that as Europeans, we cannot apply two-dimensional, so to speak, ideas of good governance or democracy and then solve a three-dimensional problem, which in fact means that you cannot cut and dried apply those ideas on the ground there.
Okay, you're jumping the gun a little bit. You're saying, though, we're going to get to it, though. You're saying we are coming with false expectations in terms of the situation on the ground.
That is correct.
Do you agree with that?
Yes. The notion for the last 65 years was we develop you. Nobody said, how can we develop these nations by their own resources? How can we mobilize their own capacities and abilities? And how can we enter into a relationship that is looking eye to eye and not one side is the giver and the other side is the taker, and then you take the package or you leave it?
Okay, both of you have established that the system that we have right now is broken for a number of different reasons. That has been confirmed. All of your concerns are shared and brought concisely together by a man who is a part of the old Ethiopian elite, Prince Asfa Wasson Asarate. He just published a book about the vicious circle of poverty and migration. And all these issues come together: famine, poverty, migration, warfare. And he says it is the governments in Africa and here as well that are failing to make sure the relief gets to the right programs and the right people. Let's hear what he had to say.
In my opinion, one of the main reasons for African migration is poor government. An estimated $2 billion worth of economic aid has flowed into Africa over the last 40 years from all over the world. But during that time, the lives of average Africans have not changed much at all. That is simply absurd. And the governments are responsible for it. The politicians treat this aid money like it was their own private fortune. What's particularly upsetting is that these African dictators, and some of them have been in power for 30 or 40 years, are taking advantage of funds that have been provided by European taxpayers.
Kiflemariam, let's come back to you on this. You're back from Ethiopia. The prince, of course, is from there, belongs to the old elite in that country. Is he right? Is it that bad? Have corrupt elites completely destroyed the aid system?
Well, I think if you consider it on a global, on an African scale, then I think we have ample evidence by now that the number of these foreign aids money has been dwindling and going through wrong hands. Simply because so far the funds were relatively easy to get. You write a project proposal, you cry foul, and then you get some sort of money, and it is also for the Western world or for the donor world. It was a large way of making your political mark by giving aid. And of course, for this to happen, so if corruption is happening, we know latest since the Panama Papers, that system functions only if there are two sides. The one that is corrupt and the one that takes over money, which is illegal, the banks, the financial institutions.
Okay, we're going to get to their role in a second. Dagmar, you've done a lot of reporting in East Africa. Does your research corroborate what we've just heard?
In parts, of course. The problem is that a state like the German state can only deal with another state. And there you are exactly at the center of these corrupt elites. I mean, it's obvious.
You have to work with them.
You have to work with them. You cannot work around them because they are sovereign states. You cannot treat them like some relatives you don't want to deal with. You cannot work in a country if you do not deal with the government in a country if you are a state. Of course, you can do it on other levels. But even that becomes worse and worse because the African governments are not stupid. They know what's going on, and they know that if you try to help the civil society to organize itself, then this is a political power which might go against him or, in very seldom cases, her. And of course, then they don't want that to continue. And then they make NGO laws which makes it impossible to help such civil society movements to grow.
Jörg, you've been in East Africa. Your company's dedicated to bringing back part of the African diaspora in the U.S., in Europe, back to Africa, the brain drain, to reverse the brain drain. What do you see? Is your assessment the same? Is the system broken?
First of all, the system as such is functioning in its own restricted manners. And there is a daily business according to which people have managed to get around or somehow dig in and do whatever they can to live in that system. However, we're not talking about the same state structures that we know here. And this is the message that I have for any European, at least, also from my generation. We as Europeans, I believe, have to come to accept the fact that for societies, any society, to grow and prosper, it needs organic growth of state structures. It needs an inherent societal conviction, so to speak. It needs an inherent culture of accountability and responsibility.
Those are huge goals.
Those are huge goals, and I know that this will take generations, but we have never kept given it a chance, really. Only we have done is patronize this continent with a notion that it needs to be developed. But language is powerful, and who am I to judge who is not developed or who is developed in the case of having no money or no status? When you look at East Africa or Uganda, exactly, Uganda is the best example. We're talking about oil resources. The region is rich. South Sudan, the same case. We just don't have state structures. That is the problem. And you can only give this a chance if you allow the young ones, and I think the diaspora plays a crucial role in this, to contribute to the rebuilding of those structures.
Okay, and it's all about giving people the opportunity to contribute, isn't it?
And it's about us and ourselves and letting go.
Letting go of what?
Of our patronizing attitude.
Okay, what should it be replaced by?
It should be replaced by economic cooperation in the truest sense. I'm not talking about Glencore. I'm talking about small and medium-sized enterprises from the European continent or from the North American continent. Anyone from tractor manufacturers to medical aid kit suppliers or logistics companies. Anyone who can create a job on the ground will automatically create another 2 or 3 jobs, either in the formal or informal sector. This is where we can tie in.
But we just heard from Dagmar, for example, there's incredible corruption in these areas and state structures that we barely understand. Dagmar, do you see an inherent problem in creating this reality on the ground that Jörg just described for us?
In East Africa, and that is what I now want to talk about, you have a situation that even in Kenya, which is the most developed of those, you have no real strong institutions. You do not have a judicial system which is working like a judicial system we are used to in Europe, that a judge is deciding along the law and that's it. You have a judicial system where the president always can say, but you have to convict this guy because of whatever. It always can happen. And if you have institutions which are circling around a president, then you always have the problem that when the president changes, he will throw out everybody with some experience.
The system
collapses, and then you have the same situation again. And that does not build up institutions. And we, only in part, can help that. That has to develop by itself.
Kiflemariam, is Jörg's view and vision of what can happen, it is indeed a vision, naive, impractical? I mean, can it work? Is it too visionary?
No, I think the mobilization of the resources of these countries is, I think, a central point. Until today, we've been working on cargo culture principle. Something comes in, something is parachuted.
Cargo culture. Okay.
Yes. And then people say, okay, now development will come up. No, it doesn't work that way. There is no nation, I want to emphasize, that has been developed through development aid. It's true. Development has to come from inside, and that means, if you take the example of Kenya, my colleague mentioned, we have $8,000 millionaires in Nairobi. Why aren't they mobilizing resources?
Why aren't they mobilizing resources?
For Kenya? Because until now, there are others, EU, USAID, whoever it is, who are readily there to support and bring about some kind of donations. So we are a donation-based approach. What we need is a developmental approach. And that means to mobilize the resources and take the people of the country also to task. The millionaires I talked about, the $8,000 millionaires.
In Kenya alone.
And Kenya alone. 2,000 to 3,000 in Ethiopia and many other countries. And if you take South Sudan, I think that is the most glaring and current example where a state is running havoc, destroying the economy of the country, just for the sake of staying in power, the elites you talked about. But we are not ready. The diplomats and German ambassador in Kenya, he's not ready to say who the culprits are, to name and shame them. Okay, that would be one major approach.
Naming and shaming is very important. We're going to get back to that. That's a central issue in this catastrophe that's unfolding. Dagmar, you know, have we as journalists failed, I'm getting that impression, to bring the reality of the problem to the public in Europe? Have we fallen down on this?
Of course we have failed. I mean, we, as media system, we are not really paying correspondents on the ground. That is where it starts. And then we have the same issues as our governments have.
So let me just jump in. We need to have more paid African correspondents in English and German getting the word back to us what's really happening. Okay,
exactly.
I'm sorry.
That is the one point. The other is that, of course, Africa has not been seen as such an important continent. And so we pay for a correspondent in Washington, but not for one in Nairobi or in Addis. And of course, without that experience, we have a big problem in understanding the structures, the political structures. Okay. If you are not there every once in a while, you have no idea what's going on.
I'd like to jump in and say this network, DW, has made a real commitment. And we have reporters on the ground, and we're very proud of that. and it is something new, and we are certainly proud of that. Jörg, what do you think about this? How do we get a real assessment of what's happening so that we can identify what are the broken areas and how to fix them? How do we get an assessment going?
An assessment as such is maybe not even possible. I want to go even further than what you said. I believe we are dealing with a structural problem. Since the beginning of the 1960s or the independence surge of African states, Europeans have not really managed to grasp or fully comprehend the African continent. I know that's a very devastating statement.
That's an indictment.
But I truly believe that, and it deals with the fact that we have not understood its plurality, its diversity, its dynamics, let alone its mere size. I always encourage people to Google the True Size of Africa map, which was published a couple of years ago by The Economist. And it shows how Africa, in mere size, sucks up North America, Europe, and large parts of Asia. And now we come in and we try to transfer our really well-intended ideas of good governance and democracy, and whereas in fact we have not really been able to make an impact on the ground.
Okay. Democracy, does democracy have a role in what I'm hearing from Jörg? Is democracy is not something that it can play a role in helping Africa?
I think we should stick to democracy because we don't know a much more better system of control and checks and balances than democracy. A number of African governments and others are trying to impress on us and saying as if democracy wouldn't work for Africa. It works for Africa, provided that those who are in power are playing by the rules. So I think it's a fundamental thing. But blending it, for example, with African traditional checks and balances, with the role of the elders, with many other African checks and balances that we have not discovered, that have been completely thrown out of the system. That is, I think, what one of the things we need to do.
Kiflemariam, when we were talking just before coming in here, you said that ethnic divisions are being used, especially in South Sudan, to yes. Keep people in power, and that weapons are a key part of that. Can you expand on that, how weapons and ammunition is playing a big role right now?
I think the case of South Sudan is really, like in a nutshell, showing us what has happened between 60, 61, when many African countries became independent, and what we see today. Here you have a government that came to power about 5 years ago after a brutal and long 40, 50 years of fight. The government is in place, but doesn't want to share with the other parts of the ethnic or of the political spectrum. They are using the war. The war is not a byproduct of the famine. The famine is not a byproduct of the war in South Sudan. It's the goal itself. And this is what we see. So how does it happen? Because a number of arms have been delivered there for many years. The shelf life of AK-47 or G3 is very 25, 30 years. What they need today is ammunition. And they get ammunition.
And who's providing the ammunition?
Different countries. Chinese ammunition has been on the ground. Belarus has been there. There are speculations that some have come from Belgium. So the ammunition is the oil with which you can do any kind of fighting. You might have the weapons. Without the ammunition, you can do anything.
Is this an area, Dagmar, that should be reported on more? The weapons flow from Europe included into Africa, East Africa.
That is one of the many topics that should be reported more, yes.
Okay.
Of course. I mean, that plays a major role, but the political conflicts behind are very seldom understood or even taken into notion. I mean, nobody really is interested in which political fraction is fighting which political fraction. In Europe, you get the impression, or in the German public, might be the right guys, and if they kill each other, why bother? And that is a big mistake.
Jörg, what do you see as being the way towards increasing interest in Europe, first of all, in the problems in East Africa, beyond the famine, the problems that lead up to it, that we've been talking about, the political ones, the human ones?
What I always try to do is bring up stories about daily business and daily life, bringing some normality into the European narrative about Africa. What we were dealing with all these years was this never-ending tale of crises and catastrophes. I have a very exciting story to tell about a friend of mine whose sister is currently, as we speak, turning out to become an opposition leader in Uganda. Stella Nyanzi, former research assistant from Makerere University. She is, in fact, what I'm talking about. She represents a younger generation that is trying to remind the President Museveni, who has been in power for 30 years with really nothing to show, of his promises during his campaign. And part of that was handing out sanitary pads for girls. So she is using social media, and she's doing it in a very provocative manner, to remind everyone that they are also in charge of demanding what they so clearly seek as their own right. And we have to trust these people. We have to trust the young generation, because they have the feeling that there is a big gap between them and the older ones.
Kiflemariam, what would be your message to the younger generation Jörg just identified to help them move their nations, their regions forward in spite of famine, in spite of all the problems we've been talking about?
I think I just returned from Kenya a few days back, and we know that in Kenya, for example, there is this M-Pesa system, which is a system to transfer money by mobile. It was developed, designed, and implemented, and now exported from Kenya. So, and the young people have done that. That is in the digital world. And I think there are a number of sectors where that creativity has to come up. And of course, to fight for the room for space, operating space, civil society operating space. That is one of the things that is lacking in Africa. And the young ones are, I think, taking it up because of the social media. It's a huge and new dimension of bringing and promoting your own ideas without necessarily running on the streets.
Dagmar, briefly, if you could, we're wrapping things up now. Do you see the young as the hope of East Africa?
Absolutely, and if the old understand that it's not always the big factory that brings the development, but the young that are growing and maybe become big then, if they understand that, they take the lesson from actually the German development.
Okay. Jörg, what do you think in terms of the diaspora returning home? That's one of your issues. Do they play a role in all of this?
I think they play a key role. When we're looking at data, we're dealing with approximately 3 million academics from Africa living in Europe right now.
3 million.
And surveys show that at least half of them would be returning home if they had the opportunity, a career perspective in their home country. So this is what we're trying to really tackle here. If those people came back, they would have a great impact on the ground, because they're the ones who are coming back with talent, with expertise, and who can really change and shape their societies.
Kiflemariam, is this the best way forward?
I think so. I do agree that the diaspora has got a huge potential. They are vast in numbers. They are usually well organized. They have a lot of knowledge and accumulated expertise. I do also know that some of them are spoilers, but that is probably a minority, because they are intervening into their societies and trying to change things while sitting in New York or in Berlin. I'm part of the diaspora, so I know what I'm talking about. But I think we have never seriously taken them into the boat, trying to mobilize them, trying to find out what are actually not only the objective needs, but the felt needs of these people, and how can they be an interface between the countries where they live, usually in industrialized countries, and back home in Africa. I think these potential has not been really exploited, And I'm glad to hear that some organizations are trying to focus.
Okay, it's been a great pleasure to be with all of you today, identifying not only the problem, but some ways forward and some possible solutions as well to the famine in East Africa. I'd like to thank my guests today, Jörg Kleis, author and blogger and co-founder of Africa Works, Kiflemariam Gebrewold, a longtime development aid worker, and Dagmar, Dehmer, journalist at the Berlin-based Tagesspiegel. Thanks so very much to all of you for our show today. And thank you for joining us as well. Remember, we'd like to hear from you in the comments section. Drop us an email, follow us on Twitter. I'm Brian Thomas. I look forward to seeing you again here at Quadriga. Bye-bye.